All right. So welcome back to Sociological Theory. Today we are going to be discussing early sociology, Marx, Weber, Cooper, and Cooley. So we're going to be looking at Karl Marx's work on capitalism, Weber's work on capitalism, and his take on the idea of how religion plays a role in essentially rationalizing capitalism. Also, we're going to talk about Cooper's work. We kind of discussed it a little bit. I would say maybe maybe like last week or so, we talked a little bit about Anna Julia Cooper, especially as it pertains to Black feminist thought and how Black feminist thought and how she was kind of the foundation, and particularly her book, Voices from the South, or A Voice from the South, kind of sets the stage for about a century later when Patricia Hill Collins would eventually create this term Black feminist thought and literally curate the literature and start the literature discussion that will lead to what we now call Black feminist thought and sociology. So we're going to talk a little bit about Anna Julia Cooper. I believe she was the first Black woman to get a Ph.D. I know she was the first Black woman. I think it had something to do with a Ph.D. I don't know if it was from a particular school or if she was the first one in general, but something of that nature. And then Charles Horton Cooley. So we're going to end with talking a little bit about Cooley. So going to the next slide. This is an outline essentially of this first part, early sociology. So we're going to start with there, looking at going straight into early sociological theories. And that's essentially what this whole lecture is about. But with this first section on Marx, we're going to look at how Marx analyzes modernity. And I call it modernity, even though another way of looking at modernity is also modern. Modernity is also looked at, I forgot who wrote that book, but A Modernity and the Holocaust is the name of the book. And so basically it talks about how the Holocaust brought about modernity, but they're talking about 20th century modernity, and Marx is kind of talking about 19th century modernity. So I just don't want you all to be confused if or whenever you read that text. That's a different kind of modernity. So I use modernity to talk about 19th century, how Marx analyzes the way in which feudalism leads to capitalism and how capitalism has led to modern industry and how modern industry has essentially exacerbated social inequality. And then we're going to talk about how this exists not only in the United States or in Western countries, but also how this exists globally. So how does this modernity, how does modern industry, and how does the way in which capitalism has been pervasive, how has that affected not only people in the West, but also how does that affect people in social inequality globally? So that's what we are going to look at. So before we get into it, what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to pause this video and I would like for you to watch this YouTube link, okay? Parental advisory, explicit language. So if you are sensitive to, certain types of language, you don't have to watch it, but it does help us. It does give us a framework, and then we're going to kind of break it down a much easier and a much more lighthearted way of understanding what we're getting ready to talk about, because we're going to go into some, it may seem a little bit boring to some people, but a more academic way of explaining the same thing. So I just kind of wanted to give you all a different way of seeing it, and then we'll break it down even further. But again, if you don't like to hear certain types of language, particularly explicit language, they use the F word a lot, like right in the middle of the video. then you can maybe watch the first couple minutes. When they start using the F word, you can fast forward to the last couple minutes or something like that. So yeah, go ahead, pause this, watch this, and then come back. So now that you are back, this kind of helps us understand what Marx was talking about when he was essentially castigating capitalism, right? When he essentially had kind of a beef with capitalism, if you will, and why. And Marx, though he didn't necessarily call himself a sociologist, that's essentially what his teachings and what his analysis, it ends up setting the stage for early sociological theories. Marx he probably would have called himself an economist, and definitely an historian, definitely someone who understood the history of economics, the history of people, and the way in which he came about it was very much provided the foundation for this discipline, our discipline of sociology. So starting off, Lemert, who is the author of the book, talks about how the history of society is the history of class struggles. So when we think about the triumvirate of sociology, right, race, class, and gender, right, those are the three kind of bases for how we understand social interaction, right, race, class, and gender. Out of those three, the struggle that I think that goes back the furthest is probably the class struggle, right? Men and women and the gender tensions that exist and the sexist societies that have been created, though older than race, I don't believe go as far back as the class struggle. The struggle between poor people and rich people, the struggle between farmers and rulers, right? Later on, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat have been happening since biblical times, right? Even if you want to use the Bible as a kind of a historical text, before you saw gendered relationships that were seen as unequal, right? That were seen as women having to fight for or look to be treated fairly, there were class tensions, right? There were people that were stolen from or mistreated, right? There were people who wanted money and greed, and people who tried to hoard their money, right? I'm not a theologian per se, so I can't think of like when the Bible was the first kind of woman's issue. But you can clearly see from a current day perspective that there were these it was an unfair treatment of women, but that's using kind of what's the term? Is it reductionist history, I believe, or yeah, I think it's called reductionist history or something like that, but where you take the present day mindset and you place it, revisionist history. You take the present day mindset and you place it back into ancient times in order to make an assessment. And that's not fair. Right? You can't take a 2021 mindset, put it in the, BC 900 mindset and say the way you're treating that woman is unfair because it's different. Doesn't mean it is right, or it doesn't mean that even back then it might have been considered right. But we also have to consider the times. I can't remember if we talked about it in this class or another class. I think it was another class where we talked about, had that conversation around slavery. But that's essentially what we have to do, right? Now, even then, you still see earlier elements of class and greed and class tensions that I would argue predate even strong gendered issues or strong ways in which women collaborated to fight for their equal rights. And then, of course, I believe we talked about this before, race is very, very new, very, very modern. And so out of all of the identities, it's probably the one that is the baby, right, of all of these identities. And so when you think about the history of class struggles, you have like the freeman and the slave, right? You have the patrician and the plebeian. You have the lord and you have the serf, the oppressor and the oppressed, right? And so this has always been a thing from the very beginning, from the time that people, essentially the time when people moved from being hunter-gatherers to actually building civilizations next to water sources, right? If you think about like early Mesopotamia or something like that, right? And you may have remembered this from your history courses. So yeah, maybe like early Mesopotamia, East Asia, West Africa, or East Africa. So these areas where you start to see early forms of civilized life, right? Again, people starting to build areas, learning how to farm, building areas next to the water sources, and then people who had access to the water sources, people who had access to the resources that came from planting, would gather the food, they would sell it, they would trade, they would do whatever it is they needed to do. And then they would maintain riches that way, right? So this is when you start to see a difference between people who have and people who don't have. It's not really a middle class yet, but we will get to that, later on. So from that time until Marx is talking, there's always been this class struggle. And how do these class struggles usually end, right? What makes us move from one struggle to another or from one era to another? Typically, and there's a lot of proof to this, whether you're a Marxist or not, whether you're a socialist or a capitalist, there's a lot of truth that shows that these struggles typically end in some type of revolution. It typically ends in some type of revolt or rebellion, right? Whether you're talking about the French Revolution, right? Definitely a class struggle there. Whether you're talking about the American Revolution, to some degree a class struggle, maybe not as strong as the French Revolution, but definitely a class struggle in that people felt they were being mistreated and taxed and they weren't being represented, right? Exploited upon because of the wealth that they brought in. The Crusades, right? Couched in religious ideas, couched in religious ideology, but essentially they fought for who was going to have access to the Holy Land because the Holy Land had rich resources under it, right? And so you can go down the line of how revolutions, war, rebellions, struggles have helped to end one era of a class struggle and begin another era, or end one era of a political struggle and begin another era, right? We can go down and down the line with Civil War and all these other, even if you just want to stay in the US context, even to this most recent time, even to this very year. What was the essentially considered a revolt, riot that occurred earlier this year? When Donald Trump was leaving office, there were people who felt as though their powers were being infringed upon, that their rights, their voting rights were being infringed upon. And so what did they do? They rebelled, they revolted. Some people would call it a revolution. Other people would call it a riot. But essentially there was a violent pushback because of this political struggle, essentially, right? So this has been going on for a long time, and that's typically how they end. And so what Marx does is he kind of gives us the history of capitalism, the history of the class struggle, and then shows us where he stands. And so he says almost everywhere in early history, you see this simple or even complex kind of social rank. And then he goes on to talk about the most recent one. Now, he doesn't go into mercantilism. So I want to say mercantilism actually comes out of feudalism, I believe. So I believe it was feudalism, then mercantilism, and then it was capitalism, where these kinds of socioeconomic systems that helped us to determine and understand how people lived and how people navigated society. And so, but we're going to focus more on the feudalism part and how feudalism led to capitalism. So if we focus on the feudalism, you see that feudalism is the social system that existed in Europe. And it was during the Middle Ages. People worked, right? People worked and they fought for the nobles. And essentially the nobles, the people that were in charge, the kings, the queens, the dukes, they gave them protection. So you work for the state and you get protection from the state if anybody decides that they're going to attack. Also, you get to use the land in return. You get to use the land to farm, to make a living for your family, and then hopefully be able to sell something, right? So you can have a little extra money. You never own the land. The land belonged to the nobles. The land belonged to the state. The land belonged to the powerful, but you got to use it. You got to keep a little something for yourself. You fought for the state and you were protected. Now, a lot of modern writers might say that Marx points out the negative qualities of feudalism, like the exploitation, the lack of social mobility. Once you were a peasant, you stayed a peasant. There was no becoming a peasant to becoming a noble to becoming royalty. There was nothing like that, right? So there was a lack of social mobility. Clearly, these people were being exploited, right? They fought and their bodies were given in exchange for land that they would never own and in exchange for protection that they would always need. So there was really no way out. So Marx looked at that as being unfair, right? But then you had other people, who suggested that the peasants were part of this feudal relationship, right? And while they, again, were giving this military service, they got it in exchange for something else. And so this protection that they received was a benefit, albeit limited, but it was a benefit to them, right? Now, one of the major external factors that led to the transition from feudalism to capitalism was the fact that trade began to expand. So now you're looking at, because I want to say this, you're looking at feudalism, what was it, maybe like the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. This was the Middle Ages. As you're going more into like the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, what we start to see is we start to see trade expanding as boats are getting bigger, as people are starting to branch out. And now trade is something that more people can participate in, not just people with money, right? So now you have people who are getting involved with trade, and these merchants are starting to prosper. So these same people that used to have to give up their bodies to protect the state in turn to get land that they would never own, now they're saying, oh, I can make money this way. I don't have to give up my body for the state to make money, because now I can make money trading. And so now they're becoming prosperous on their own. So this was happening as Europe was becoming more stable. So you're looking at the Middle Ages, where now Europe is slowly but surely starting to rise in terms of being a world power. Prior to that, there were other areas. There were parts of Africa. There were Egypt. There were other areas, the Chinese at one point, other places that were much more powerful, and now it's Europe's turn. So they were this very unique class of individuals, these merchants, that weren't bound by the obligations of being a vessel, of being a soldier that rented land. So they conducted trade in their own interests. And in doing that, pretty much everything would come to a standstill. And so the merchants started to transform society. So now it wasn't about subsistence farming anymore. With subsistence farming is simply you farm just enough so that you can take care of your family, and then that's it. So it wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, day to day. Now these common people are making money, and they're making a lot of money, and they have a lot of resources. So now society is becoming much more economic. Now the people on top have to figure out a different way to tap into this new market. They got to figure out, tap into this new market, tap into these new riches, right? Outside of just taxing them, because you could tax them, but they were making so much money, they probably didn't even mind paying the taxes on it, right? So, and they didn't necessarily have that kind of system in play at that time. So they had to find a way to revitalize the notion of capital gain because of this new trading system. And so this new merchant class provided money to the kings. Now they're giving money to the kings. It doesn't mean they're more powerful than the kings, but they definitely have enough money to loan to the kings. And so the kings had a lot to gain by this trade. So now we have these merchants who are making money. We have the king who provides protection. We have the king that essentially who gives power. And so they're trying to figure out, well, how can we make this work? And so the kings did not want to give up the trade. They didn't want to stop people from trading because they were making money off of it. They were getting money off of it. When you think about Columbus, right? And when you think about the fact that the reason why, I think he started with Portugal and then ended up with Spain, who gave him the money to explore the West. He was able to come back with slaves. He was able to come back with resources. He was able to come back with all of these things that helped make Spain rich, right? And so again, the kings and royalty didn't want to give up the trade. They didn't want to lock down the trade. So monarchs could now start to raise money through these merchants, and what they ended up doing was using this money to build armies. And they built armies that were only loyal to the king, and they began to pay for mercenaries. If you remember anything about mercenaries, which were also used in the American Revolution, were people who their only job was to fight for whoever was paying. So there were people who fought in the American Revolution that were not American, that could care less about anything that was going on in the United States. They were either Spanish, they were German. I think a lot of them were German mercenaries who said, hey, you pay me a certain amount of money, I'll fight for your military, right? So these mercenaries didn't have a whole lot of loyalty, only the money, and they were feared all through Europe because these were professional fighters, professional soldiers. And so Europe was able to pay these mercenaries to fight for them in exchange for money. So this was also a way in which feudalism started to die, because now you didn't need these people anymore to fight for you. You could pay these mercenaries. And now we were moving towards a much more economic way of being, an economic way of protection and economic social system. So that was one way in which feudalism died and capitalism became the dominant way of life. Another external factor that weakened feudalism was the demographic crisis. So can we talk about this? I teach so many classes and do so many lectures, I forget which one we talk about in what class. But if we did talk about religion, oh no, that was my race class, I think. Okay, yeah. So religion was a part of how the notion of race came to be, right? Issues between Christians and Jews, right? So they had beef with each other. And so in around the Middle Ages, and so with that came notions of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, discrimination, and then that led into, that with the age of European expansion led into the racism, right? Creating this notion of race and justifying race through racism, right? So we talked about that. And around that same time, you had around the 14th century, you had a couple things happening. You had the bubonic plague, you had the Great Famine, you had the Black Death. the Great Famine, there was a large decline in agricultural production. So the lords of the land had to come up with different ways of sustaining themselves. You had the Black Death, which was a huge decrease in Europe's population. So labor was a valuable commodity. You also had the bubonic plague that was blamed on the Jews, but it was really the Jews who they said had poisoned the European water supply, which was not the case. It was really just a bunch of rats that came off of the trading boats that were coming in, and these rats were poisonous, and so they would run into the water supply in the towns. They would die, but when they died, the poison left their bodies and went into the water, and then the people would drink it, and so that's how a lot of people died, and that was, the bubonic plague, and so in turn, that ended up causing an even further rift between the Christians and the Jews. And so this is kind of how people understood, these things to occur. Also, in addition to that, some people believe that the bubonic plague was not spread by rats. Some people believe it was spread by human beings. So there are different kind of stories, right, around these things happening. But either way, we know that it was not an intentional act on Jews to kill off Christians, right, which was a large belief at that time. And so again, with this big demographic shift and a lot of people dying, this also gave way to a different type of social system as well. So in conclusion, the platform that held feudalism together and held it in place failed after some time. And so the mechanisms that put it in place weren't stable enough to fend off this notion of capitalism that was starting to rise. And so what came to be termed as economic freedom was essentially what capitalism was. And maybe in the beginning, that's what it was, but then it eventually got exploited and expounded upon in a way that has now, to a lot of people, been synonymous with greed. And so the Renaissance in Europe, right, the cultural Renaissance that happened in Europe also took a toll on feudalism. People started to embrace art, technology, change. And in this embracing of change, people looked at the medieval times, people looked at feudalism as archaic and wanted to embrace more of the ideas of the modern world. And so it is out of these ideas, these philosophies, that you start to get capitalism, and capitalism starts to grow and develop and change. And what Marx argues is, as it begins to change and as people begin to take advantage of this notion of capitalism, what we start to see is essentially two classes. So now he's moving us to like more of the 17th, 18th century, and you start to see, no, that's a 16th and 17th centuries, yeah. And 18, yeah, 1700s as well. So now you start to see, only two classes, right? So as capitalism is starting to grow, it's only benefiting those nobles who begin to use it to their own advantage. And those super, super rich merchants that end up being essentially part of the nobility, not based on blood, but based on the fact that they got money. So Marx says that eventually what you have is you only have two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We've talked about this before, but you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? And those are essentially the only classes that make up our society when we move forward into capitalism. This is early sociological thought. So this is the sociological thought that is helping to shape the discipline and helping us to come up with the theories that we still look at even today. And so Marx talks about how the discovery of the United States, and I would even argue as well as colonization, kind of opens up a brand new market, right? So already capitalism, already this mercantilism is happening. Already capitalism is in its baby stages. Once people find out there's two whole continents on the other side of the world, there's a bunch of people over there, there's lots and lots and lots of natural resources that we can glean from the land. And there's labor that we can use. This is more than a gold mine. Okay. This opens up a brand new market. Now we can either sell to those people over there or get rid of them, take over the land, put more people over there, let them have babies and create generations and generations of people. And that's an entirely new market for our product. So essentially what colonization did and what the establishment of the United States did was it created modern industry. It expanded wealth, dramatically, exponentially. And then in turn, as wealth is expanding, as technology is expanding, as science is expanding, now we're moving into the middle part of the 19th century where Marx is writing, and now he's saying, and that's bringing us right into modern industry. That's bringing us into the mechanization of society. And we already talked about the mechanization of society and the industrial production, industrial revolution, and how that then expands wealth, expands where we see capitalism really being exploited, and expands inequality in a way that Marx would argue has never existed in the past. Not to this extent, right? Let's see. So now moving on to modernity. And so what we see with these changes from feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism is with all of these, we see long histories of revolution. That is how we got here. That is how we got to our current social system and economic system. It was revolutions. It was people fighting. It was class tensions and class struggles. And so these changes in the modes of production, the exchange of goods and services, all of these things would always lead to some type of revolution, some type of change, which typically called for a modernization of society, right? So every advancement of the rich was accompanied by some type of political advancement, right? So just like in feudalism, merchants started getting rich. The nobles say, oh, we got to get in on this. And as they're making and doing business with the merchants, now that's changing the way military is structured. Now that's changing the way politics is structured. Now it's changing legislation. And now it's changing how the governing bodies have these shared similar interests with super, super rich people, common people, and how all of these things work together. And essentially what always ends up happening is that no matter what, as society is changing, as long as the people in power can find a way to get their hands on it and control it first, they will always have the upper hand. So we can read, let me see, we go back to, I think it was 37, okay. And I want to read the paragraph that says, the bourgeoisie, wherever it is, gotten the upper hand. So, yeah. So that's at the middle to the end of page 38. Marx says, the bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal patriarchy idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal wealth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. So you almost want to ask Marx, well, how do you really feel? Because clearly you don't like this thing, right? And he talks about religion. He doesn't go too deep into it, but Weber will, so we'll talk more about that religious piece in a second. But you can clearly see that Marx is not a fan. And Marx is saying this whole thing is essentially about money. So he didn't necessarily like feudalism either, and he definitely saw some limits and some inequality in feudalism. But he's saying this thing called free trade is there is nothing moral about it, or at least there's no type of morality in how it's being played out, right? Let's see. And so then the question is, but hasn't there always been rich and poor? Right? We just talked about that. There's always been a history of a class struggle. And yes, while that is the case, that's true, but the revolution of production is directly related to perpetual disturbances in the social conditions of the poor, underclass, and marginalized. And so when you had issues related to class struggles, typically they just stayed at the class struggles. But in this modernity, in this new age, these class struggles are now transforming into gender struggles, into racial struggles, into political struggles, into discrimination, into entire people being wiped out and wiped away with over this. Now you have, what was the gentleman? I mean, this was really just one of the worst. I mean, I've studied history for a long time and I've read some atrocious stories, but the one about the gentleman, oh, what was his name? I think he was Scottish. Can't remember. But it was during the colonization time in Africa. If I can remember, I'll tell you. But I mean, just what he did to those African people. I mean, I think he slaughtered like millions and millions and millions of them in like a very short amount of time. Definitely something very similar to what Hitler did in the Holocaust. It might have been even more. He might have slaughtered more of them than Hitler did in the Holocaust with modern technology like gas chambers. Yeah, I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head right now. But essentially but it's all for the sake of free trade. It's all for the sake of expanding profit and capital. And so now you have this ambiguous life that workers, people of a certain color, poor people, second-class citizens, they have that they did not have in the feudal times. This ambiguous life where you don't know what's going to happen to you from one day to the next, from one season to the next, because of essentially this notion of greed. And so what we see now again in this modern industry is that the bourgeoisie has, for the most part, they have exclusive rights to the politics of the land. There's nothing that anybody can do to, it appears, to have any type of equality, not even move towards that direction. And what Marx is saying is that it doesn't matter your party, doesn't matter your affiliation, unless you come from a revolutionary party that's going to rise from the bottom, that's going to come up to the top, that's going to, just really type of guerrilla warfare, unless you're coming from that perspective, unless you're grounded in the common interests or the interests of the common people, the politics that a person puts forth, no matter what your party is, and it wasn't like Democrat or Republican then, but in how we understand it now, whether you Democrat or Republican, you're still for the people that have. You're still for the ruling class, right? Maybe in a different way, you may have different language. There may be some who swing more this way with certain things than others, but at the end of the day, that's what you have. And Marx is arguing that is what you have in capitalism. And politics is there to maintain the ruling bourgeoisie class, period. There may be a little give and take between them, but overall, that's all it is. And so the bourgeoisie in the areas where they rule has done their best to widen the gap of this social equality. And Marx would use the words egalitarianism. And so they did it by, again, trying to end feudalism, ending earlier forms of socialism, anything that created ideal relationships between the class groups. One thing that Marx talks about that's really interesting in this text is he talks about how, and again, we're going to go more into this when we go into Weber, but he talks more about how the simple way, the jobs that had a certain level of reverence, right? The judges, the doctors, the artists, the scientists. These were the jobs that help society, help us become better people, right? These were the jobs that were deemed sacred. Doctors. I imagine doctors probably didn't make a whole lot of money because your job is just to save people. That's just what you want to do. You want to help people live. And you weren't getting paid ridiculously amounts of money to do that. Judges, regular people, made sure that society was stable and people did what they were supposed to do. And people got punishments that they deserve. Or people got rewarded for things they should be rewarded for. But Marx says after capitalism, everything is about money. Even morale has become commodified. Even just keeping people alive, how much money does that cost? Even getting justice, how much money does that cost? Even having the arts to bring beauty to our society, how much money is that going to cost? Only in a capitalist society can you getting justice depend largely on how much money you make. Only in a capitalist society, according to Marx, can you being alive depend on how much money you make. Your health care and the care of health that you have depends on what kind of plan you have. The better plan you have, the more likely it is that you'll have quality health care. But that plan is going to cost you what? More money. And what Marx is saying is under feudalism, it was never that way. These kinds of jobs would have never been commodified. Now, the best artist creates the greatest beauty, and the best beauty is concentrated among, the nobles. Wherein before an artist, yeah, you get paid, but you were just painting to make society and to make your world look better, to reflect who you are. Now in capitalism, in modernity, it's all about money. And so basically what Marx says is all that is holy has been profaned in modernity. Anything that was sacred is commodified now. It's profane, it's secular, no matter what the job is, because it's only for money. And so this is what Marx says is part of the problem with capitalism, part of the expansion of going from feudalism to capitalism. And this is what he believes sociology should study. And he says this isn't just an issue that affects, now we're going on to the next slide. This isn't just an issue that affects the West. Marx was in Germany, not just Germany, although it was affecting Germany for sure. Germany, England, United States. He said this is a problem that's now affecting the entire world because globalization is making people now adopt capitalism. It's making people adopt, and we couch it with democracy. Democracy is a idea that long predates United States, long predates Europe. Earliest democracies was in ancient Egypt, Northern Africa, right? But it's different when you're talking capital. It's different when you're talking these modern times. Democracy is a loaded term. And there's a lot of implications that Marx is saying is couched in greed. And so essentially what Marx is saying is that globalization is the way in which capitalists want to create a world after its own image. And it does this by creating this insatiable need for markets. We have to have a market to sell. We have to have a market to sell. We have to have a market to sell. And so it broadens the bourgeoisie worldwide. Now the bourgeoisie doesn't even have to just live in the West now. Now the bourgeoisie can be in the West, it can be in the the southeastern part of the world. It can be in the southwestern part of the world. Now it can be in Australia. Now it can be in Abu Dhabi. Now it can be in Russia. Now you can create the bourgeoisie in people of other racial groups or ethnic groups if you want. They can be a part of it, but it's not really, and Marx isn't doing a racial analysis at all. It takes other people to do that, people like Du Bois. But essentially, the bourgeoisie is now not just white, male in Europe. Now they're everywhere. But just because the color of the bourgeoisie is now changing and becoming more diverse doesn't necessarily mean that that class struggle still exists. Just because you have the super, super rich white people in Europe and the extremely poor white people in Europe doesn't make it better, because now you have extremely rich extremely rich Indian people in Abu Dhabi, and then you have a mass, population of poor people in the same place. So it doesn't necessarily make it right that the bourgeoisie is now becoming more racially diverse, right? The enhancing of the means of production creates civilizations and forces people to adopt capitalism. And so that's essentially what capitalism does through globalization, is it says, now that we control the means of production here, now that we've created a bourgeoisie, now you have to depend on this system. Now we can make you look like us. First thing we're going to do is we call it civilizing you. And that was the one term I didn't like that Marx uses. And maybe he's using it in a satirical way, I'm not sure. But essentially, his argument is that they're now making more Americas, more Englands, more French, more Germans, in terms of the way in which their society looks. And that's why you had Russians who were fighting back. That's why you had the Chinese who were fighting back. That's why you had the Vietnamese who were fighting back. Because they're saying you can't force us to adopt this. Essentially, some of them would. Chinese has been good about doing both. So they still have very much a socialist idea, but certain parts of their system is very much capitalist, and they've made a ton of money off of it. But they still maintain some socialist ideas, communist ideas. It's quite interesting studying China. And so again, globalization makes it so that it is a world after the capitalist's own image, and it makes the world look exactly like it. Also what capitalism does is it creates urbanization, not just in the United States, although modernity has created urbanization that has led to huge cities like New York or Chicago, DC, but also places like Tokyo and London and Johannesburg, South Africa, and Moscow, Russia, and all these huge cities where a lot of people flock to for jobs and opportunities and education. And so these type of places, Lagos, Nigeria, these type of places are the results of urbanization, which is the results of globalization, the results of capitalism. Right? And so this is what we see, or this is what Marx sees when he's assessing all of these different things. And so the question is, now going to the next slide, the question is, what are the results? Right? What are the results? Go to the bottom of page 40 and top of page 41. It says the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. So the results, according to Marx, you're going to keep doing this. You're going to keep expanding inequality. You're going to keep forcing capitalism. You're going to keep trying to make a world after your own image. You're going to keep commodifying every sacred institution, the medical institution, the law, religion, You're going to keep commodifying it. And the only thing that happens is what we said in the beginning, is revolution. People are going to revolt. And more than likely, it's going to be bloodshed. And many times people act surprised. Why are people marching? Why are people marching in the streets? Why are people saying Black Lives Matter? Why? Why are women having one of the largest marches after Trump was elected that we've seen in modern history? Why do we have the Million Man March? Why do we have anti-war? Marx is calling it. You can't continue to do people this way and expect there not to be a revolution, a revolt, Arab Spring. Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes cars get blown up. Sometimes things get set on fire. Sometimes people die. Right? And so when people have become aware of their losses, of their alienation, and especially in a universal non-human situation, sometimes it's possible for them to proceed to a radical transformation of their situation in a different way, but more often than not, there's going to be a revolution. And the revolution will be the prelude to the establishment of what he would call communism, and what he believes is a reign of liberty that is reconquered. And so for Marx, there are two views for the revolution. One is this kind of final idea of revolution through violent suppression of the old conditions of production, right? And then the other conception is that of a permanent revolution that involves this provisional coalition between the poor working part of the proletariat, and then maybe like the revolutionary bourgeoisie, like the bourgeoisie that's also about the revolution. And they'll then come together and create this mission and this revolutionary education of the entire proletariat that will transfer the legal power from the revolutionary bourgeoisie to now the revolutionary proletariat. And the people are gonna rise. The masses of people are gonna rise. And so that's the idea that Marx believes is going to exist as a result of his assessment of capitalism, right? So what I would like for you to do, I want you to look at these two links. They're pretty short, and both of them is an interview that took place in 1992 with a rapper by the name of Tupac Shakur. Some of you may know who Tupac is, some of you may not. I think all of you were born probably after he was murdered. But he was a rapper, famous rapper in the 90s. He was a revolutionary, he was a political activist, and he was someone that a lot of people, especially people coming in the generation he was born in and after him, look and still look up to. And there have been courses taught about Tupac, and there have been whole conferences about Tupac Shakur and his impact on young people, on Black people, on oppressed people worldwide, right? So I want you to listen to what he's saying in this interview. And he's probably 1992, so he might be 2021 when he's saying these things. And I want you to listen to what he's talking about in this interview. And then I want you to engage in the discussion board that's entitled Early Sociological Thought and Capitalism. And I want you to answer the following questions. How do you see Marx's thoughts in Tupac's response? Where is Marxism in what Tupac is saying? Where do you agree or disagree with Tupac's answers personally? So first tell me where Marx is. Now tell me what you think. And then do you think Marx would agree or disagree with Tupac? And then how has the conditions of the poor, Black and marginalized changed since Tupac made this statement in 1992? Now, for some of you who are historians, maybe you know about 1992 and the LA riots, the beating of Rodney King, the killing of Latasha Hollins. If you are African-American studies people, maybe you may or may not be familiar with that. But there's a lot of police brutality going on in Los Angeles during this time. You have a group called NWA They create a song called F the Police, which talks about police brutality. A lot of people thought that they were making it up until it was actually caught on tape. And then a large part of Los Angeles was burnt down, revolution, because people were tired of being mistreated, Black people, right? And so this is the era that Tupac is talking. This is why you hear the anger and the frustration and all of these things he's talking, because he's literally in LA at this time. He's rising in his career as a rapper during this time. And so he's speaking to a lot of what we're just talking about. And I want to see if you can see some of the similarities, maybe even the differences in what they're saying. So I look forward to your discussion, question, answers. Water. So before I go get some water, all of these instructions should be fulfilled before noon on September 6th. Okay? So before noon on September 6th, you should, is it September 6th? Oh, wait. I think this might be the wrong date. Hold on real quick. Okay, so sorry about that. So no, this should be fulfilled before noon on September 10th. Okay, September 10th. So my apologies. So yes, that's when this discussion board and everything around it should be completed. So that is that. Let me know if you have any questions. All right. So let us move on to Weber. So with this idea of capitalism, right, as a main idea of society, right? Some people are looking at these systems, complex systems supported by this larger system, as moral, while other people are looking at them as immoral, right? And what Weber ends up doing is Weber, while Marx is looking at this strictly from an economic standpoint, who has money and who doesn't, Weber is saying there's something deeper about this, something deeper. And not only is this deeper understanding of capitalism necessary to its existence, but also if this is something that will be in perpetuity, right? And we can't just look at it from the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. We need to add a religious component to this, because religion then and still now plays a huge role in the decisions that people make. The church, God, people's perception of God plays a huge role in the decisions that people are going to make. And so we have to understand how that plays a role, how the spirit plays a role in capitalism. Because how this thing continues will be largely based on if it is accepted by the spiritual community. And so what Weber does is he looks and assesses, and he might be even seen as a historian as well. And what he finds is that in this modern enterprise, I sometimes call it modernity, modern enterprise, modern industry. Everybody kind of uses different language. He says that a large number of these owners and businessmen and capitalists, they're Protestant. This is interesting because it's different from when Catholics ruled. And Catholics ruled during a different time and under a different system. But with this rise in capitalism comes a rise in Protestantism. Why is that? So now he wants to see this connection. This is what sociology does. And this is people with the sociological imagination. This is what they do. So he's saying with this rise in capitalism comes this rise in Protestantism. What's going on? And so what he ends up finding in the 16th century, many sections of the wealthy old empire that were developed economically, a lot of these people in the wealthy old empire, they turn Protestant. Why are they turning Protestant? Why are they leaving Catholicism and becoming Protestant? Especially when Protestantism wasn't the most accepted at this time. You got to think about Martin Luther had to he had balance because people was trying to get rid of him. Nailed his 95 Theses to the door. You probably remember that from history class. Nailed his 95 Theses to the door, right? And so the Protestant church, which grew out of, access to knowledge and the printing press and all that, you know the story. It became increasingly popular among the common people. Now, my thought is that these common people soon became merchants, held on to these Protestant ideas, and they started getting money. And then now, if the nobles want to work with the Protestants, they probably was Catholic and say, well, if we want to continue to do business with these people, probably got to think the same way they do in terms of spiritual ideas, probably need to start moving towards Protestantism as well, right? That's just my thought. Weber didn't say that, this is just me. So what he said is that he will find businessmen, skill owners, other technical and trained personnel of the modern enterprise in a large number. Many of these people will be Protestant in this modern day, in these modern industries. And so what Weber says is that when capitalism is present without social differentiation of people, when capitalism is present, but all people of a certain group are adopting this, and when there is more freedom, it results in the participation of Protestants in the economic fields, management, and industrial enterprises. And so what we start to see is there is more Protestants. There is very little religious or social differentiation among these people. And now Protestant ideas and Protestant people are now controlling capitalism. Right? And so what ends up happening in addition to that is that the education is also starting to increase among Protestants. So what's happening with the first generation of Protestants, and then when they start getting money, what are they going to do with their kids? They're going to send their kids to the fancy schools. They're going to send their kids to the fancy universities so they can have a high level of education, maintain the wealth, keep the family business going, find a way to expand it even more. And they're going to send their kids to the fancy schools, and it's just going to keep going and going and going like that. So the percentage of Protestant students that were studying and graduating, the percentages of them that were getting technical jobs, industrial jobs, way more than Catholics. So now Protestants are starting to have and control the capitalist market. They're controlling the market. They're controlling the money. People with this certain spiritual idea they are controlling the way in which trade and economics is done at this time. So now we got to look at, well, how did Catholics run things, and now our Protestants now running things? So Catholics believed in piety and security. That's what they were all about. Being pious, being secure, being protected, even if that meant not having knowledge, as we can see with what was it? I'm forgetting. Man, I'm forgetting all that stuff from history. Where people would pay money to stay out of hell. I can't remember what it's called. It's gonna come to me in a second. But essentially, people would pay money, right, to have their sins forgiven. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't think of it. But pay money to have their sins forgiven, right? Even though it was wrong, as long as I'm secure that I know I'm not going to hell, I know I did something wrong last night, but I'm secure I'm not going to hell, keep it moving. So Catholics believe that. Protestants were more about capitalism. Protestants were more about the economic fields that resulted in making money, in turning a profit. Protestants believe more in this way of thinking and expanding their social mobility, expanding their power, expanding their position in society, which then in turn led them to say, we need to create a religious idea that justifies this. And probably because some people may have felt bad. So they said, well, this has to be backed up by the Bible. This has to be backed up by spirituality so we can feel better. And that's how Weber says they created the spirit of capitalism. And you'll see examples of it as we move from Europe over to the Americas. And his argument is that the spirit of capitalism is essentially keeping an eye on profit and maintaining an ethics of business. That's what it is. Keeping an eye on your profit, maintaining an ethics of business. And so the correct usage of capitalists or of capital, according to the Protestants, were that making sure that there was this gaze, constant gaze over your profit, constant gaze over your labor, making sure that you're maintaining an ethics of business, an ethos of business. All of these things were related to the spirit of capitalism. Now, there's two types of capitalism. There's the old capitalism, right? Then there's this new capitalism. And so under the old capitalism, religion was absent. It was all about money, right? When capitalism first started, as feudalism is slowly dying off, capitalism is slowly rising. We're not really trying to add God into this mix. This is about maintaining society, keeping the country going, keeping the rich, keeping the poor just enough to live so that they can work. And that's it. So there was no religious focus. How can we rationalize this through the Bible? Right? Old capitalism felt that religion drew people away from labor. Maybe religion was the thing that made people lazy. Interestingly enough, Marx would say the same thing. Religion as an opiate of the masses, not in terms of making people lazy from labor, but making people lazy from revolution. He believed that people who were religious said, well, I'm not going to fight for what I believe in. I'm not going to fight for what's right. I'm going to let God handle it. God is good. Turn the other cheek. You don't have to create a ruckus because we're all going to die and go to heaven. Right? This is his idea. And he's saying, man, religion makes people lazy, makes them an opiate, or it is the opiate of the masses. It gets them high off this idea of life and God and everything's going to be fine. And they don't even know what's happening right in front of their eyes. That's why he calls it an opiate, because he considers it a drug. And opium was the dominant drug at that time. It was something that was used to get people high. He looked at religion the same way. You get high off of it, you have this feeling that everything's going to be fine, and you lose track of what's really going on. So he would probably agree with it a little bit to this old capitalist idea. It draws people away from labor, it draws people away from reality. But this new capitalism, I'm losing my place. Yes. So, yes, this new capitalism was this rationale. The spirit of capitalism of the Protestants was a rationale for why it was necessary for them to participate in this level or this economic system to this level at the extent to which they were, why it was necessary for them to get rich and to stay rich and to pass that wealth down to their generations. And the reason why they felt it was necessary was because Protestants felt they were the chosen ones. Look at the Calvinists. Calvinists felt very strong about this. They felt they were the chosen ones. And the capitalist system was seen as a devotion to the calling of making money through business and trade. They said God called us to this position. God told us we have to be the ones to have this position because we have the moral standard not to take it and not to exploit people, not to oppress people. If we're not the ones who hold this position and somebody else has all this money, somebody else has all this power, somebody else has all these resources, they're going to misuse it. So we have to be the ones. We Protestants, we Calvinists, we people. Calvinists is just like a sub denomination of this larger kind of Protestant belief system. So they believe they were called. For them, capitalism was a way of life. And anyone who did not follow it, they could not rise. The spirit of capitalism is understood as rationalism. It was a way to rationalize why it was necessary for Protestants to be the ones to be super, super rich, super wealthy, super powerful. And they tended to use it as the fundamental element for capitalism. There's the fundamental element, this spirit, this calling. Some people may say, "Oh, that was Europe and they was tripping." No, United early U.S. leaders believed that too. It's called manifest destiny. You've heard about it in your American history classes. Manifest destiny is the same thing. God has called us to this land and he's called us to expand on this land. So in order for us to do that, we need to keep moving west. So it's a whole bunch of Native Americans over there. What you gonna do with them? They gotta go. Because that land is for us. Why? Because God said it. So we can't sit too high on our high horses because the United States practiced that same thing. Again, it was a way of life, and any other way was not mobile. Any other way was not right. Any other way was not Protestant. Any other way was not the way God wanted people to live. God wanted his people, his chosen people to live. So Calvinists believed in the doctrine of predestination, that Calvinist people were predestined. They were the small group of chosen people that were supposed to essentially live well and be in power. God chose them for that. And it was the grace of God that created it that way. And so this notion that people exist to serve the glorification of God is how a lot of Protestants fail. You glorify God by doing good in life. By doing the best you can in life, you are obeying God's commands. Let's look at page 102. And let's look at the middle. So you see that paragraph, it says, it is Benjamin Franklin. Let's look at that, the last three sentences, where it says, truly what is here preached. Truly what is here preached is not simply a means of making one's way in the world, but a peculiar ethic. The infraction of its rules is treated not as foolishness, but as forgetfulness of duty. That is the essence of the matter. It is not mere business, astuteness, that sort of thing is common enough. It is an ethos. This is the quality which interests us. So again, they believe that God is commanding for good social achievement and activity in social life, which can be linked to the labor and calling of Luther's concept, where the service of labor is impersonal and serve for humanity. So when people are serving humanity, in a way, they are doing God's will. Calvinists believe, Protestants believe, that this service of humanity through creating and maintaining power was what God wanted. At the same time, they also to their credit, Protestants believed that they should not live extravagantly. They believed in simplicity. Wherein the Catholics, that was one of the issues that Martin Luther had with them, right? Martin Luther had an issue with the fact that a lot of these Catholics were poor, and the rich preachers and teachers and leaders of the church were living in these ridiculously fancy houses, had all this land, had all this money that they was getting from, I think it was called penances. I think that was what it was, where people would pay so they wouldn't go to hell. Right? And so without this religious idea, capitalism just appears to be this mundane passion. It's just this thing, right? That it just seems like it's greed. And that's what it started to look like to a lot of people. So then the Protestants came up with this notion of the spirit of capitalism, which made it look better, made it feel as though God has called us to this, and rationalize why this was necessary for them specifically. Another concept that we find in the spirit of capitalism is this, that is used to extend this, what Weber says is really just rationalism for being involved in the way in which Protestants are now holding firm and maintaining their monopoly on capitalism, is the iron cage. The iron cage is kind of, well, I don't want to go into that. The iron cage is this term that increases the rationalization intrinsic to social life, particularly in the Western capitalist societies, and it explains that the people are required to show formal and impersonal behavior with the enlargement of these organizations, people that are alienated from each other. So essentially, what Weber says is happening with the spirit of capitalism is that these people are trapped. They're trapped in these systems, they're trapped in these organizations, which run off the principles of efficiency, rationality, and control. When we get to, I think we're going to talk about, who am I forgetting these names? The French guy. Oh, I forgot his name too. Oh, I'm getting so bad about it. But, oh, that's irking me. Hold on. I found it. Foucault. Similar to Foucault, right? French sociologist as well. Essentially, what these people are caught up in, even though they're making money, is this rat race. Organization systems where it's all about efficiency, it's all about money, it's all about control. The iron cage of rationality reflects the pressure that builds over us due to both others and ourselves to act and behave in certain ways. Society forces us to behave in a certain way. We behave in a certain way. It is presented to us as the only beneficial strategy for us. And then in turn, we then get rewarded with product. We get rewarded with resources, right? So the concept of the iron cage is essentially, and the way in which we will understand it in the present day is, this is what you do. You're born, you go to middle school, you go to elementary school, middle school, high school, you get good grades, you go to college, you finish college, you get a good job, you work at that job for 30 or 40 years, then you retire, you have a good pension, you have a good retirement, you have a nice home, you have a beautiful spouse, you have kids, and then you die. And that's it. That is the way it's supposed to be. And that's what you do. And that's what a majority of people do. It's the condition where things become so rational that enjoyment, Weber is saying, can't be felt. The enjoyment of life is going away. while doing them, nor can a person add their personal values to work. I go to work 9 to 5. I clock in at 9, get off at 5, come home. I do that Monday through Friday. I do that day after day, week after week, month after year, decade after decade for 30 years, and then I retire. And that's it. I may retire at 60, 65. Then I might live another 10, 15 years, and then I'm dead. That's my life. And the people in the organization, they really feel trapped. They really feel like they're in an iron cage, but this is what society says. This is what I'm supposed to do. And a lot of people may not figure it out until they're halfway through their retirement. And they're like, wait a minute, I'm 50 years old. I'm 10, 15 years from retirement. And I'm realizing I hate this. I feel trapped. I feel suffocated. There's nothing more to my life than going to work, doing this, coming home, having vacations once a year, twice a year. I live in a nice home, but that's it. What more does life have to offer me? Is there any other enjoyments outside of this? But Weber says this is what capitalism, this is what the spirit of capitalism does. It forces people or encourages / forces people into this iron cage, and they stay there. And they go and they can't go out. They retire. They don't know what else to do. By the time they may figure it out, they may feel like they're too old and they die. And even if they don't like it, what do? They teach their kids the same thing. This is what I did. This is what my parents did. This is what my grandparents did. This is what you do. So the younger generation says, well, I want to, and I want to branch out. And the parents say, well, I'm not going to pay for college. Or I'm not going to do this. So now I'm forced to do what? Enter into that iron cage and do the same thing. So Weber says modernization creates hedonists without heart and specialists without spirit. There's no spirit. Weber's looking at these capitalists running around Europe, running around the United States. They're looking at these people that's going to the factories and coming home and living. And they're like, there's no excitement. There's no spirit and there's no life. They call it the spirit of capitalism, but it's really a death. The spirit of capitalism is really robbing the spirit out of the people. It's robbing the enjoyment of life out of the people. And it's robbing the heart out of the worker. So it's quite fascinating what Weber is finding when he's assessing what life is like in 19th century and 20th century Europe and the Americas. So how does this apply to today? Does the spirit of capitalism and the iron cage still apply today? That's an interesting question. And you don't have to write this down, but I do want you to think about it. And if you want to, I've had students to kind of email me their thoughts or inbox me their thoughts and I'll respond. And yeah, you can do that. We can engage in thoughts with each other. Sometimes I may make a discussion board, and sometimes I just want you to think about it. I don't always, unless you want it to be a discussion board, then I can, if you want to hear what the rest of your classmates have to say. Sometimes I'll make it an assignment, sometimes I won't. This time I won't. But do you think that still exists today? Do you think the spirit of capitalism, this iron cage where people are, I personally do. I do think that society is kind of forced to be in this iron cage still today. There's still one way in which we see this is how we're supposed to make it. This is what we're supposed to do. There's some people who go off on a tangent. You know, you have your Mark Zuckerbergs, you have your who founded Apple, Steve Jobs, you have your Bill Gates, who follow their heart, go with this idea, run with it, and become successful. But granted, they all came from very much upper middle class families. If your family don't have money like that to invest in these pipe dreams, what would be considered to them at the time was a pipe dream ended up making them billions and quadrillions of dollars. All right? They would have been okay without it. If their dream failed, they still would have been upper middle class. But most people who may not have that luxury, I do think they're forced into this iron cage. I do think that the spirit of capitalism can still exist. Because again, we see aspects of it even there. Well, the spread of democracy or the spread of capitalism, this is the way in which everybody should live. Whole wars have been fought to civilize society and to create what the West sees in other places in the world. Still, at least in my opinion, you definitely have your own. Are we forced to continue the iron cage or the rat race of life today? Sure. I do see where people are starting to branch out, your generation mostly, who are starting to use the phone and the internet to create opportunities for themselves outside of the mundane or what is expected. But if we think about it, most people, including myself, go with what is considered to be the standard. Because where am I? And where are you? In a college classroom. That's the standard. That is what is expected. You graduate high school, you go to college, you get a good job. And maybe that's what I did too. And the thing about it is there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do and that's what you're passionate about. Personally, for me, I'm passionate about what I do. There wasn't anything that I gave up to become this. When I was like 20, I wanted to be a rapper, but besides that, but there was nothing that I no real passion that I gave up. There are other things I definitely want to do in my life, and I think I still have time to do those things. But there's nothing wrong with going to college. There's nothing wrong with moving your life in the way that you want, if that's what you want. I think what Weber is arguing, though, is that when you get into this rat race just because somebody told you to, or you get into this iron cage because somebody forced you to, or because society told you this is the only way that you can go. And I do think that while we live in a democracy, while we live in a way that, and we say we're free thinkers, we say our society promotes and encourages free thinking, does it really? Does it really? I don't know. Because we may have talked about it in this class, I can't remember, but if you decide, I don't want to get married and I don't want to have kids, especially if you're a woman, if you say, I don't believe in God, if you say, some people may argue this, some people may not. I'm not saying one way or another. So don't say I'm saying one should do one thing, one should do another thing. If you say I'm getting the vaccine, some people may say. If you say I'm not getting the vaccine, some people may say. And then treat you a certain way based on your beliefs or your ideas. So while we're not forced into a certain thing or a certain way of thinking, in some ways we are. It's an activity I would do with my class sometimes around social media and ask how many of you all are on social media. And most students are on social media. And then I would ask, do you feel like you were forced to be on it? Or did you have the freedom to be on it? And most people say, no, I don't have to be on it. But then what would happen if you decided that you weren't going to be on social media? Because you're right, you can log out, you cannot have a page. I have a friend who has never had a social media page. I'm really surprised it's been that long, but my own boy has never had a social media page. It's just not him. And he still knows what's going on social media, but he's never had a page. But somebody who's never had one at all, that's highly unlikely. Why? Because everything is on there. You get your news, you get updates, you find everything on social media. That's where life is. So though you're not forced to be on it, though there's no law that says you have to have a social media page, you kind of got to. Right? So we have to think about, are we forced to do certain things, or are we forced to be socialized into a certain idea? I think so. But I'm a sociologist, so maybe that's why. Does technology free us from this life that Weber is describing? So it's technology, it's our phones and creating opportunities on Instagram and Facebook. People get paid 6 figures from posting now. Is that freeing us from this iron cage that said you got to do it this way? Now you got some kids that may drop, students that may drop out of college, post videos, and make a great amount of money. There's this one guy I follow on social media, and I think he graduated college, started posting videos, and now he's making way more money than he would have had he probably used his degree. Right? So is technology freeing us from it? I think in some ways, personally, I think in some ways it is. But I also think that because of the world in which we live, there's going to be a way in which that will also be regulated. And there may be an iron cage placed on technology as well, and how it's used. So this is one of my favorite podcasts, Joe Rogan. I don't know if any of you watch Joe Rogan. Know Joe Rogan, listen to Joe Rogan, but his podcast episodes, they're long, but they're interesting. You don't have to watch the whole episode. This is just a clip. But listen to what Joe Rogan says about this, and listen to what the person that he's interviewing says about this. And definitely explicit language. If you know anything about Joe Rogan, it's not clean language that he uses. So just prepare for that. But I want you to think about whether we still live in an iron cage and why, and is it possible to escape after you watch this clip? So I want you to think about that and why. You don't have to write it down. You don't have to submit anything. You will later about something else, but not right now. Okay. So now we will move on to the last few slides, the colored woman's office. All right, so the next slide, I would like to share this screen, and hopefully it plays the video and the audio. We'll see. All right. Is it gonna play?
The most disrespected person in America is the black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the black woman. The most neglected person in America is the black woman. And as Muslims, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us to respect our women and to protect our women. And then the only time a Muslim really gets real violent is when someone goes to molest his woman. We will kill you for our woman. I'm making it plain, yes. We will kill you for our woman. We believe that if the white man will do whatever is necessary to see that his woman gets respect and protection, then you and I will never be recognized as men until we stand up like men and place the same penalty over the head of anyone who puts his filthy hands out to put in the direction of our women. We respect them, but we want them to respect us. We think that the law should respect the Negro community. The law should protect the Negro community. The law should approach the Negro community with intelligence if it expects the Negro community to react intelligently.
Okay, so hopefully that came through. If not, you can always just click on that link. But that is that clip of Malcolm X saying that the most disrespected person in America is the black woman, became popular and went viral, and more people have been using that clip. I think Beyonce used that clip in a song or in a video recently. And what it does, and what Malcolm, and even though Malcolm X said this 60 years roughly after Anna Julia Cooper kind of said the same thing in the latter part of the 19th century. What it does is it brings about this intersectional approach to understanding both race and gender. And so in Anna Julia Cooper's work, A Voice from the South, there is one section that is taken out and placed in this book. It's called The Colored Woman's Office. And again, Anna Julia Cooper's work sets the stage for Black feminist thought. We talked a lot about this in the last, I think it was the last lecture, so I won't go too deep into it. But I do want to read a couple of sections from here and then kind of expound on it, talk a little bit about intersectionality, and then we'll move on. So let's look at page 176. And so it says, only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or spatial patronage, or I'm sorry, special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. What does this mean? What does this mean? She says, when and where I enter, and this led to a book called When and Where I Enter. And again, has set the stage for how we understand Black feminist thought and Black womanhood in academia. When and where I enter, the entire race enters with me. What does that mean? What you think about that? And what I gather from what Anna Julia Cooper is saying is, when and where I enter, the entire race enters with me, means that the Black woman is the gateway to understanding the entire Negro race. She would call it Negro, we would call it Black now, or African American, but particularly Black, right? Because Black encompasses more than just the African American experience. But when and where I enter, when and where the Black woman enters, that's when you get to understand Black people in general. And so Black women hold this responsibility of the entire race. That's why, one reason why Zora Neale Hurston, and then was it Patricia Collins? I can't remember who, I think it was Patricia Collins we talked about last time, called Black women the mule of the world, right? But that's the reason why, is because Anna Julia Cooper says, when and where I enter, the entire race enters with me, because the entire race comes from the Black woman. They give birth to the Black race. And so the question is this a positive responsibility or is it a burden? Some people may look at it as being positive. If you've ever seen any interviews with Oprah Winfrey and Maya Angelou, both of them say that where I enter, 10,000 people enter with me. Basically saying, I represent my entire group. I represent Black women. Though I have my own thoughts and my own ideas, and other Black women may not share my ideas, I still represent them in dignity and in respect and in the way that I engage with people. And I know that they have my back wherever I am. That can be seen as a positive responsibility. Some people may see it as a burden and say, well, I don't want to represent an entire group. I'm just representing me. I don't want you to see me and say, oh, all Black men think the way Dr. Grant thinks. All Black women think the way Anna Julia Cooper thinks. No, not at all. No group is a monolith. So the question could remain for some people, is this a burden? When and where I enter, the entire race enters with me, or is it a beautiful responsibility? Is it a beautiful understanding of support that Black women either are calling or may feel that they have from their entire race, or the responsibility that they have of bearing and creating an entire race? Something to consider. The Black woman, while they have this, some people may say beautiful responsibility, they also have this burden of being Black and woman. So they have these two oppressive traits that cancel each other out. Because again, we're talking about the 19th century. So we're talking about, or the latter part of the 19th century, we're talking about a few decades after emancipation. So women definitely don't have a lot of rights during this time. And Black people, well, you can forget it. Because women had gotten the right to vote maybe a decade or two after she wrote this. And Black people didn't have the right to vote for another almost 70 years. So there are these two oppressive traits that as a Black person, you're subjugated in terms of race, and as a woman, you're subjugated in terms of gender. And sometimes they just cancel each other out to where you're just like, I have nowhere to go. And this is why she says, and then later on, Malcolm X says, the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, because she's Black and she's a woman. She's at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. So you need a whole nother theory to be able to understand this. And this theory is called intersectionality. Let's look at page 177. And if we go to the part, it's early towards the top, she says, I see two dingy little rooms with 4 ladies swinging over one and 4 colored people over the other, while wondering under which head I come. So she's saying my identity does not let me know. I don't know where to go. Do I go in the colored bathroom or do I go in the woman's bathroom? Because as a colored person, as a colored woman, I get treated, I get mistreated from the men in my race. As a colored woman, I get mistreated from the women in the other race. So I don't know where to go. So this identity negotiation that Black women have to deal with, that no other people at the time in the United States had to deal with, is very important. And it's very unique and it's very significant to understanding what Marx is talking about, what Weber is talking about, what has been created out of capitalism, this racism, this social stratification that exists in that day's society and still exists in today's society. If we really care about people and really want to understand people and the way in which they interact with each other in their environments. So Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, critical race scholar, and we'll definitely talk about critical race theory later on, UCLA law professor, activist. She uses the term of intersectionality, intersectional feminism, to describe how gender and race and class and all of these other factors play a role in the oppression faced by an individual. How you have to have all of these things and look at the way in which race and religion and class and education and ability and sexual preference and age, how all of these identifying factors that cannot be left out when you're trying to understand particularly womanhood. And then later on, people in general. Because none of us are just one thing. If you're white and you're male, you're white, but you're male, but you're of a certain class, but you're of a certain sexuality, you come from a certain region, you speak a certain language, you have a certain educational status, and all of those things play a role in who you are. I'm Black, but I'm male. Some people may consider middle class. I'm from the South. I'm African American. I have a Ph.D. I have a daughter. I'm a father. I'm all of these different things that all play a role in my identity. So I'm not just Black or just male or just whatever. And so intersectionality is necessary for us to understand the depth in which people enter into the world. And it is extremely important when we talk about the depth in which we understand when and where women, particularly Black women, enter the world. And so what can be the future of the Black woman? Well, if we look at page 178, we see sorry, not page 178. I would say, let's go to page 180. So let's go to the next slide. I would say page 180. And let's go to that middle paragraph, the very short one said a European writer recently, except the Slavonic, the Negro is the only original and distinctive genius which has yet to come to growth, and the feeling is to cherish and develop it. Everything to this race is new and strange and inspiring. There is a quickening of its pulses and a glowing of its subconsciousness. Aha, I can rival that. I can aspire to that. I can honor my name and vindicate my race. Something like this, it strikes me, is the enthusiasm which stirs the genius of young Africa in America, and the memory of past oppression and the fact of present attempted repression, only to serve to gather momentum for its irrepressible powers. Then again, a race in such a stage of growth is peculiarly sensitive to impressions. Not the photographer's sensitized plate is more delicately impressionable to outer influence than is this high-strung people here on the threshold of a career. And so this argument is that the future of the Black woman here is that she can commodify this success. This success, or the success of the Black woman, is also the success of America. Invest in us. Look at us. We can represent this race, and this new burgeoning race, though African people date back to ancient times. African Americans, this new race, this new ethnicity, if you invest in us, we can be beneficial to you, and we can be beneficial to this society if you allow us to be. One thing she also talks about is, I think that's why I had 178 right there. Is it the responsibility of the white woman to help advance the rights and the equality of the Black woman? And so if you read, now am I right? This is the first, I think, full paragraph on page 178. Now am I right in holding the American woman responsible? Is it true that the exponents of women's advancement, the leaders in women's thought, the preachers and teachers of all women's reforms, can teach this nation to be courteous, to be pitiful, having compassion one of another, not rendering evil for inoffensiveness, and railing in proportion to the improbability of being struck back, but contrariwise, being all of one mind to love as brethren? Can we depend on the white woman to do what is necessary for the Black woman? And she's saying this should be the case because you all have been going through a similar thing that we've been going through. Not exactly, but you know what oppression looks like. So is it the responsibility of the white woman to help advance the rights and equality of the Black woman? Something to think about. I would say it's the responsibility of everybody. Everybody who says they believe in freedom and democracy and equality for everybody. But particularly the white woman. Because what Cooper is saying is that you come from where I'm from. Not completely, but you get it. So for you to now have these opportunities to be accepted by which later on she talks about, accepted by your people, and then deny me, that's immoral. That doesn't make sense. And we were literally fighting together. So Anna Julia Cooper raises these questions and raises these concerns and charges and challenges the people to know that when you forget about the Black woman, you forget about the Black race. And when you forget about the Black race, you forget about the most important group that has helped build the United States, that has helped create what it is that white folks benefit from. And so this is what Anna Julia Cooper is arguing, and this is what she is concerned with and suggests, and not only just in the Colored Woman's Office, but A Voice from the South, a book as a whole. With that being said, Cooley. So I do have an assignment for you. This is an online assignment. I want you to explain Cooley's looking glass self-theory. How is it similar and different from Du Bois's double consciousness and souls of Black folk? How does Du Bois expound on Cooley's idea? Can both of these theories be applied to the realities of 2021 Americans? If so, how? If not, why not? Cooley, hopefully you've read Cooley by now, but also we're going to go into Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk next week, and we're going to talk about double consciousness theory. So you definitely want to read that as well in preparation. And even if you can't understand it within the reading, Google it, right? Google it, watch some videos on it. It'll explain double consciousness. And then talk about it. Talk about it. Write about it. I want you to address these questions and statements. Write a 1 to 2 page paper, double space, Times New Roman, 12 font. The only information that should be at the top of the page, your name of the class, and the title of the essay, optional. The deadline to submit this is Monday, September 13th at 1 p.m. Submit under online assignments. Okay. But I want you to answer those questions and address those statements. What is Cooley talking about? What is Du Bois talking about? And how are they similar? How are they different? What's going on? How does Du Bois extend Cooley? Right? How does he extend this looking glass self theory? Interesting. And this shows how sociology continues to build on each other, how literature and understanding literature continues to build on each other. So we're going to talk about that. Okay. Let's see. That is it for August 8th and August 10th. So if you have any questions, email me, inbox me, or see me during my office hours. I've been enjoying some of the students that have been coming to the office hours. We've been having great conversations. So it is open during the times that I say, unless I send out an announcement saying for some reason I won't be able to have office hours, you know, for an emergency or something, but that hasn't happened yet. That being said, I hope you have a good week. I hope you have a good weekend, a good day whenever you're watching this, and you will see me soon, and hopefully I will see you during office hours.